Hello, my name is Patrick Bond. This is better. I'm going to speak in English, so if you need the translation, I hope our interpreters will forgive me for speaking quickly. I will try and be brief, and my idea is to give you some debates about the climate, especially after the Copenhagen summit has failed. The world elites have shown that they have no ability to plan a new world order, much less to save their own system, the system that we can call capitalism. And the problem with the capitalist system now, in exceeding its environmental limits, allows us on the left to generate many types of arguments that will lead us to discuss a new world order that would be based on respect for the environment and for people. Therefore, let me take a few minutes to see what they did wrong and why we cannot trust the elites to generate a new world order for the climate as one of the examples that we're going to spend this morning discussing how we need to reconstruct the world. Once we learn what they did wrong, we can figure out where the climate justice movement is going to take its place, especially where we look at the politics of local action and national regulation at a time when we have a very adverse balance of forces, a very weak global situation where we cannot really expect the world rulers to do the right thing, and we must plan strategies for the future around that understanding. This is a difficult argument because the world requires global scale changes to the way we organize our production, our transport, our consumption. Everything about our lives is going to have to change in the next few decades, very radically. We may be the last generation to be able to fly to the World Social Forum, to flit around the world. So we should think about what the big issues were when it comes to how the capitalist approach to the environment has gone wrong. First, in Copenhagen, we saw a debate about how much should the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases be cut. How far do we need to cut the emissions? And secondly, there was the question of the damage done by climate change and who will pay for that damage. And the third question is, what would be the mechanism for arranging a world climate policy? What we learned in the period running up to Copenhagen, and was very clear to the whole world at Copenhagen, is that on those three questions, how much we cut, who pays the damage, and what's the process, on those three questions, the capitalist strategy did not work, not even on its own terms. So let me quickly explain, and then we'll see what we were doing on the left in Copenhagen and afterwards. First, the cuts we are understanding more and more have to be so sharp that we can keep the rising centigrade temperature to just 1 degree. In Africa, they had said 1.5. For most of the scientific inputs, they said 2. But I think we got this very clear message from Evo Morales that the demand that we should be making is for 1 degree. And that means below the 350 parts per million. What we understand the capitalists did was to generate a plan led by Barack Obama with Lula, with Wen Jiabao of China, with Manmohan Singh of India, and with my president in South Africa, Jacob Zuma, as the compradors, as the allies. And their plan is going to give us 3.5 degrees and 770 parts per million of carbon equivalents in the atmosphere. So we're looking at a huge difference between what the scientists and what the victims of climate change are demanding, between 1 and 2 degrees, and what the elites are giving us this century, 3.5 degrees. And this could be very unambitious because we don't know the implications of a runaway climate scenario that could mean we get up to 6 degrees this century, a complete disaster. So the first issue, we became very obvious that the political will of the elites was not there to make the cuts. because each of those negotiating partners came to Copenhagen with a desire to fill up as much space as they could. And that included the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, negotiating to keep those cuts off the Copenhagen Accord and to allow themselves as much room. They call it space for development. What the environmental movements, the climate justice movements in each of those countries, with the exception of China, which is very quiet, what most of them have been saying is that the governments of Lula, of Singh, of Zuma, must not stand behind the poor as their way of trying to increase the carbon emission potential for their big businesses, their big industries, for their big mining houses and metal smelters. Those are the kinds of beneficiaries of carbon emissions in South Africa. And those companies make huge profits which they export to London, to Melbourne, Australia for BHP Billiton, to Zurich for Xstrata. And these are the companies, and there are Brazilian companies amongst them, which we have to fight very strongly to limit their CO2 emissions so as to make sure we have electricity and energy supplies and transport rights for everybody else. So we have an internal class struggle over the climate, particularly because in our struggle to get more electricity and more energy and more transport for the constituencies of poor people, we will have to work extra hard to limit the subsidies, the cheap electricity that goes to the biggest emitters for especially export-oriented metals and mining products. So this is the struggle in South Africa to try to address the first point, getting an emissions cut that is reasonable. Let me move to the second issue that helps us move towards a new world climate order, which is money. And this is why the climate debate is very exciting for us to enter, because it shows clearly who's a winner and who's a loser from fossil fuel capitalism. And so the demand that has emerged in the last 6 months has been for climate debt of $400 billion US dollars equivalent every year, with 2020 as the base, moving up to the year 2020, to be paid by those who have overconsumed to those who are the victims of climate change. I hope you all see, and many of the comrades here who were in Jubilee South, and the Brazilians were the leaders of the movement to get the question of the debt, who owes what to whom, onto the national agenda, when you had a referendum of 6 million people to ask, should we pay the debt inherited from the dictatorships of Brazil? And most of the Brazilians said no. Of course, Lula had to go and pay and had to sign up with IMF. He says he had to. The same situation in South Africa when we had $25 billion of apartheid debt, and even Nelson Mandela felt, well, the power is so adverse that we will have to pay that. By this time now, it's 2010, the Jubilee South movement and the activists in climate justice are saying that now the North must pay the South. Because when you calculate the debt, the ecological debt, which includes many, many aspects, Jean Martinez Allier is a great scientist who's developed a methodology for understanding the ecological debt. And if we think of the climate debt alone, not just the biopiracy and the toxic dumping and all of the other problems of the environment, but the climate debt has been estimated, even the World Bank would agree, $400 billion that the victims of climate change in the small island nations in Africa. We must say, of course, that it's very difficult to put a valuation on a destroyed culture, on a destroyed rainforest. You cannot never do a valuation and calculate the debt from that kind of destruction. But still, we should have some general idea of what it is that the victims of climate change are owed by those in the North especially, including in South Africa, where the economies have been taking too much environmental space. So let's quickly ask, what did the climate debt, that's the second issue, what did the climate debt look like in Copenhagen? Before Copenhagen, the European Union said that they would start putting in a little bit of money. 2 billion euros was the amount they said, starting in 2012. They didn't say how it would be delivered, but it was so weak that the African delegation, the African Union was led by Meles Zenawi, who's a tyrant. He's the dictator of Ethiopia. But he said, we need $67 billion a year, and if we don't get that money, we're walking out of the Copenhagen Climate Summit. This he said in August. And then there was a lot of negotiation, and in Barcelona in November, the African delegation walked out because the climate debt was not enough being offered by the North. And so then it came down to Hillary Clinton on December 17 coming and saying, here's $100 billion a year from 2020, and we'll move up to that with a fast track of $10 billion in 2012. Now that money, once you look at it, is not very much because it includes what's called carbon trading. I'll come back to that point in a minute. So the Clean Development Mechanism is the vehicle by which the North will fund the plantar monocultural timber plantation of Brazil, and they will call that paying the debt. It's a CDM, a World Bank and Kyoto Protocol mechanism that the United Nations runs, which is full of corruption. Even in September, the United Nations had to fire its main agency that verifies the CDM. And that's what Hillary Clinton, along with some aid money, would be using as her $100 billion. It's a very, very, very inadequate amount, and it's being used by the private sector to give profits to companies like Plantar. So we find this unacceptable. And so the demand still remains for that $400 billion a year from the north to the south for especially the damage done and to pay for the transformation, the new economies that we're going to need. I should just add that this is such extreme damage that not only will entire island nations be wiped out forever, but that in Africa, the United Nations estimates 9 out of 10 African peasants will not be able to grow food. So anything we do on the left for a new world order for the environment must take on board the North paying the victims of climate change, the climate debt. I hope all of you, comrades, will use that argument as you make your position clear on the environment, that the North owes the South, and that those who use too much within the South as well should be paying a climate debt.